the present, the past, and the future. Then even best the safest museums. The more museums were started, a more father and children and the parents would know. My parents said, Syed was very nice to them and visits. And we were like, no, it's a brother. We're both the best and the bad. From then to now, the museums are exciting. The interesting.
In our culture, in our shared traditions, because this is the common thread between civilizations, between countries and nations. And that is what soft power is. To do that, the best way forward is museums, and thus, museums and soft power. We have three wonderful individuals here who are art curators, museum curators, cultural consultants, and all three of them are playing their role internationally in bringing forward museums as a place to interact, interface, connect, and carry forward this legacy in such a manner that, like Mr. Akbaruddin said just now, it took 30, 40 years for a Dr. Mehta to be celebrated. But if we have our way, then museums will bring our heritage forward and everybody will know about our people and the peoples of the world. So over to our first guest, Naori, who is from Spain. And besides being, please welcome her with a loud applause. Besides being an art consultant, curator, she's also written, co-authored 2 big books on museums. Next is Deepika Alawat, who also is a novelist and has written a beautiful book, fiction, Maya's Revenge. She was part of a research team or was a research scholar for a wonderful exhibition called Splendor of Indian Royal Courts. 7, 8 years back, but I still remember the jewelry. My God, it still resonates in Victoria Albert Museum, showcases soft power of India. And finally, last but not the least, is Nalina Gopal from Singapore. Indian Heritage Center. And she, with her work, is getting the diaspora connected to their roots. We'll all begin with first you for a 15 minutes presentation. So each one of you will give your presentations, after which we'll have a question-answer session. Now the Q&A session will depend on the time taken and how hungry you are. So let's begin.
Thank you so much. And I hate to be the people between you and lunch, but I hope that it's a little bit interesting. So my name is Nairi Blankenberg. Ignore the G in there. I describe myself as a museum doctor in that I fix museums or help museums being born, maybe a museum midwife or a museum therapist. So essentially, I help clients all over the world develop museums or their cultural resources for some kind of benefit. I think that many people often say to me, oh, museums are dying, and in the digital age, when we have Netflix, who needs to go to museums anymore? But the fact of the matter is, museums are not dying. 80,000 museums in the world and growing, and 50% of those were built or extended in the last 40 years. So all kinds of people are turning to museums as a solution for something. Museums are built by national, regional, and city governments. They're built by different departments of government. This is, for example, a museum I worked on in Dhaka, Bangladesh, by the Navy. But it's also departments of arts and culture, departments of tourism, city governments, etc. The private sector is also building museums, private collections, and even civil society is building museums. This is the Red Cross Museum in Geneva, Switzerland. So people build museums for many reasons. I don't know if you've heard of the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb. And so you have there the toaster of vindication. Let me just go back and tell you what it says. Oh no, I don't have that text. But basically this is a museum that collects all the remnants of broken relationships around the world. But the more formal reasons why people develop museums are preserve collections, celebrate heritage, appeal to national pride, attract tourists, remember the past, and also prepare for the future. So this picture here is a project I'm working on in Dubai called the Museum of the Future. And the whole idea of that is to get people to think of something called predictive design. It's to prepare people for the future through showing them what kind of movements, technologies will be happening in the future. So museums are not just about the past, they're also tools to prepare for the future. So everybody building these museums, I think in one way or another, recognize that museums have soft power. They're able to influence and change behavior without paying people off or through military coercion or guidance. But I would say that many museums continue to operate in an outdated paradigm of soft power. And I think that we talk about soft power as a new development. The fact is, I mean, when Joseph Nye wrote his book, it was 20 years ago, and soft power has changed a lot. I think Dr. J here spoke a lot about some of the changes that are happening in soft power, and I think the Soft Power 30 Index is showing how soft power needs to change and also look at possibly less Eurocentric ways of evaluation. The fact is, museums are, in their core, an agent of hard power. They are formed from the spoils of colonialism and war, and this is a picture of the precursor of the V&A, actually, the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. Museums continue to be seen as representational symbols and a symbol of power, even if they come across as being different. This is another project I worked on. It's called the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture in Saudi Arabia. It was paid for $1 billion by Saudi Aramco, the big oil company. And I think that the intent of certainly the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture was not necessarily hard power as we know it, but it was a very complex exercise. Museums are seen as the voice of the 1%. This is a museum in Beirut, in Lebanon, a private museum, Tony Salame, who also runs a luxury shopping mall. And museums are also seen as a signifier of luxury. This is a Zaha Hadid building, it's a development, housing development in Miami called 1,000 Museums. And predictably, and I think rightfully, people are fighting back. People are not so interested in this old idea of museums. Museums are often in cities, in the most incredibly expensive land. They cost a hell of a lot of money to build, and they create gentrification in neighborhoods. This is the museum set up. We are the 99% against the 1%. This was against in the Occupy movement. This is here in India around the privatization of one of the art museums. And this is a recent protest outside MoMA in New York City. Shiny new buildings, shabby old wages. Because as much as we like to think of museums as being outside of the world somehow, beyond even nations, and they are actually physical bricks and mortar institutions that exist in our cities, that hire people, and that operate on an institutional basis. So I think the time for soft power, capital S, capital P of museums is over. We need to think of soft power a little bit differently. Soft power in the 21st century is not the same as soft power in the 20th century. And museums in the 21st century must speak a new language in order for them to have influence. So here's a little table. You can read through that quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time. But we've been talking a lot recently about national soft power. Quite frankly, I think that that era of soft power being held by nations is pretty much over. I wrote a book called Cities, Museums, and Soft Power because I think that soft power really sits in the translocal and I think in the urban. I think that people are not necessarily attracted to England. I think people can be attracted to London. I think that people associate Mumbai with certain things that are very different than what are associated with India. I think that New York has a completely different reputation, especially right now, than the United States of America. I think that earlier 20th century soft power was really governed by public diplomacy, I would say, strategic communications, and the idea of building reputations. I think we're moving a lot more into an era of building social capital. I think the tools of 21st century soft power are civil society more than their governments. I think they focus on participation, and I think they're different values. Rather than branding, I think we have social media, popular culture, we have festivals, mass media, we have events. I think soft power is evolving in the 21st century, and I think museums also need to evolve. So museums, like many other institutions, their soft power is actually based on trust. And there have been a number of studies around museums as being, in fact, more trusted institutions than almost everything else. More than universities, more than media, more than popular culture. They're, in fact, one of the most trusted cultural institutions, or, in fact, soft power bodies, that there is. And I think that that trust is something that we cannot take for granted. The trust in the 21st century has to be created in a very different way than in the 20th century. So I really advocate building trust through the 4 E's. And I think that if we look at how India could really support soft power, real soft power through its museums, these 4 E's might be important. The first is entrance. The second is experience. The third is empowerment. And the fourth is exchange. So when I talk about entrance, does anyone know what this is? So this is the Guggenheim Bilbao. So has anyone ever heard of the Bilbao effect? Yeah, so the Bilbao effect, it came about maybe about 15 years ago because it was this little industrial town in Spain where I live called Bilbao, and suddenly they got this big star architect, Frank Gehry, to come and make this big museum, and it transformed the entire economy of the city. And since then, everyone's like, oh my God, if we want to have urban revitalization and if we want to change from an industrial economy to a tourist-based economy, we need to build a museum. What we've since found out is that, in fact, that is not that simple. What Bilbao did, which was very interesting, is that it created the museum as part of a major project that was really centered in developing the city. And so when I talk about entrance, and I use this example of Bilbao, I'm talking about museums needing to have a relationship to the urban infrastructure in which they exist. I think a lot of the time, especially when we have national museums, we think of national museums representing India. But the fact is, the National Museum exists in New Delhi. Thousands of people walk by it every day. It exists in a particular urban context, and it needs to be seen within the structure of that context. So entrance equals creating community, and it means about, enhancing livability. And I think it's really significant that a lot of new museum builds these days create a huge, big public space outside of the museum. Because when we think of urbanization and our cities, which is the biggest trend that's happening in the world, we have a problem with civic space. We have a problem with public space, but we also have a problem with civic space. I think a Civicus director called it a global emergency on public space. Museums create around them a lot of public space that needs to be protected and preserved because we're fast losing it, especially in a city as dense as New Delhi. So this image here I think is really interesting because Vienna topped the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2018 rankings of the world's most livable cities. And this is a picture from the Museum Quarter in Vienna. And what it's created is, in fact, a free, open, public space in the heart of Vienna that's really effective. And I think it's effective because it's free and because, though, it's connected with culture. But sometimes this is not enough. I live in Barcelona, and there's a beautiful museum there called the Museum MACBA, a contemporary art museum, and it was created a big museum. It's fantastic, it's amazing, and there's a huge public space outside it, and everyone there goes to skateboard, and nobody goes inside the museum. Here's a picture of actually a Bangladeshi festival that happened a couple of months ago, and nobody went in the museum. I went inside, there were like 5 people inside. And so that is also why entrance is extremely important, because it's not about connecting just a physical connection or a public space with your cities. It's also about being free, accessible, and open. A lot of the times we have security guards in the perimeter around the museum, and we charge a prohibitive entrance fee, and we say, you know what, you're not really allowed to come in here. There's a term called the museum threshold, and across that threshold, a lot of people don't come. If you're not highly educated, if you're not typically well off, if you're not white in the West, generally you don't think of museums as places for you. And that's why I say entrance, the entrance experience is one of the most critical experiences for creating soft power of the museum. The next D is experience. I mean, museums can be wonderful places and collections are extremely important, but they're also places of imagination and a connection between the past, the present, and the future. And this is where I think exhibition design is very important. And I think in my experience in Indian museums, it's an area it's often sacrificed. So there's all this investment in the collection, and of course there's a big, massive investment in the building, but the experience, the budget for the actual design is very, very small. So this is an exhibition that I did working with a design company, Kosman de Young, in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, called Jerusalem. And this is an experience. It uses all their collections, a collection-based museum, but creates a kind of imagination. This is the visitor center for the Parliamentarium, Museum for the European Union in Brussels. And again, you can see the power of design to bring ideas to life. Experience is about imagination. And this is another project that I'm working on, which is a football museum. See, everybody makes museums. So I don't know if anyone's a fan of the Olympique de Marseille football museum. I live in Barcelona, so obviously I'm all about Barca, but I could put it aside to talk about OM. But the point is about OM is that they're wanting to create a hub for a football club that is firmly connected to the city of Marseille, but also provides a completely different experience of what football is all about. And this is one of our ideas of bridging together the brand of Marseille and the brand of the Olympique de Marseille. Another very important aspect of experience is visitor services. We need to be nice to people in museums. This is a project that I worked on for many, many years. It's the National Museum of African American History and Culture, one of the newest Smithsonians that opened in DC. And I'm very proud of that museum, and I'll return to it in a sec. But one of the key things about it is visitor services. You know, museums, again, I tell you time and time again, we put all our money into the building and into the collection, and we put no money into the people in the museums, and we put no money into the design or the lighting, and those are where the soft power of museums lie. Empowerment of visitors and staff are critical for museums. Empowerment equals representation, seeing your story, your relevant story in those museums. It means also community participation. So this is a museum I worked on in Patna in Bihar. I don't know if anyone of you are familiar with that museum. It's not completely opened yet, and I worked on two. And this was part of the community engagement process we did for the Science Center. And it's supposed to be for students and children in the Science Center, but no one ever really spoke to children or students about what they wanted to see in the museum. And this young girl, she was about 11, she begged to be included in this session, because mainly we were looking at 16 to 19-year-olds. And she was dynamite. She developed her whole idea of a museum, she came up with the whole idea, and it is something as planners that we integrated into the museum. Because credibility also means that you see your voice being displayed in the museum. But it also means multiple perspectives. If museums rely on trust and credibility, I'm finishing up, then you need to show multiple perspectives. Museums aren't vehicles of propaganda. Museums are generally arm's length from government, and a single story does not make for a particularly credible experience. And so multiple perspectives are extremely important on this. My last E is on exchange and the importance of exchange. And I think that this is, it's a nice way for me to finish up quickly and to hand over to Deepika, because I think we'll talk a little bit more in this session about the importance of collection exchange, knowledge exchange, and people exchange as being the fourth E in how to activate soft power in the museums of today and in 21st century museums. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and sorry for rushing you. May I request you, Deepika, to take the...
I think I'm going to, because we hadn't heard each other's presentation before, so I think I might want to expand a little bit on the museum, the problem with museum collections. So I think Nari spoke a little bit about how museums are products of colonialism. But I think that I need to expand a little bit upon it, largely because of the previous session, which talked about the soft power of Britain, without referring to colonialism even once. So there is now an emerging consensus that the so-called world museums, this includes the ones in Europe and some in America, are in fact deeply problematic products of colonial enterprise and imperialism. The period in which the museum structure became popular in Europe is also the period in which European powers were literally plundering their way around the earth. And most of the collections in these museums today come from such depredations. But my concentration today is not just about the objects that live in these museums, but also the way in which narratives about these conquered, colonized nations have been formed and continue to be formed even today. This is a more subtle, insidious, and in my view, a much more long-lasting loot. This is the creation and extension of cultural and narrative terrorism, which demanded, and still demands, that native and local forms, practices, histories, and objects find validity and expression only when presented in European languages, through the European institutional framework, which is the museum, and academy, which is the publishing press, and through the lens of the European, often white expert. And that, unfortunately, is how not only these cultures are framed by the white world, but it's also the most tragic part is that this is the way colonized nations frame each other. So we don't know China through what we know about China or should know through primary research. We know it through the European lens of colonialism. And that is also the way China knows us. This is a huge problem. So the colonial narrative essentially frames everything we know about the non-white world, and that's the problem, and museums are part of it. Recently, there was a very interesting debate, I think Nari was going to refer to it, about the repatriation of certain bronzes from Benin by the French president. And this should have been a universally welcome development. Finally, a colonizing power had recognized that they had no right to loot stuff from the country that they had colonized. However, very surprisingly, there were huge outpourings of opinions saying why this was a bad thing and why museums should not repatriate objects. So a very moving article appeared in Al Jazeera, of all places, and it said, I think the columnist is not from the museum world, which is why it particularly resonated with me. And she says, quote, "I wonder who appointed these museums and the white cultures they exist in, guardians of the culture, and more importantly, who are they guarding it from? The tendency for whiteness to universalize itself and elevate its own cultural specificity as a stand-in for humanity's collective heritage has devastating consequences for those who find themselves outside it." The peculiar taxonomies of display that museums engage in. For example, a curator does one gallery at a time, but what ends up happening is that vast narratives about entire civilizations get told to audiences who, as Nari pointed out, completely trust that narrative because the museum is a sacred space of propaganda. So essentially what ends up happening is that if lies are being propagated, we believe them to be perfectly true. Museums are beginning to correct this narrative, but not quickly enough. Frankly, changing a museum like the V&A overnight, or the British Museum overnight, or the Met overnight, is not possible. It's logistically impossible, and it's nightmarishly expensive. So clearly, people try to put patches on the narrative rather than correcting it entirely, which is how it really should be, but isn't going to be, at least in the foreseeable future. So how do we look at the underpinnings of how museums work? We can't do it with the older institutions because they're just too complex and there are just too many conflicting stories in there. but we can look at it when new museums get built. So I'm going to give an example of two museums that I think represent two emerging ideas about what museums can be. So the Middle East, as Nari pointed out, is a huge focus of museum building activity, and so is China. So in the Middle East, there are a couple of very ambitious museums. One of them is the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and then the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. The one private museum I find particularly fascinating is the Miho Museum near Kyoto in Japan. Can I have my slide, please? Well, anyway, it was establishing. Next one, please. It's an establishing shot of the Miho Museum in Kyoto. So this museum was set up by the founder of a religious organization or order, and in 1997. So she started this museum's process after meeting the architect, I.M. Pei, who built this absolutely beautiful building in the middle of a beautiful forest. And the founder, Mihiko Koyama's own collection was housed in this museum initially, and it expanded gradually over the years. But what I like about it is its curatorial intent. So the order to which Mihiko Koyama belonged believes that the contemplation of art is a spiritual act. So when you look at something and you find it beautiful, there is something profound and uplifting in that experience. So this museum structure exposes deliberately and consciously the relationship between the founder, the architect, the curators, and the dealer network through which the artworks were procured. So as you can see, these are two objects which are from the ancient Orient. I use the word Orient because the museum uses it. They seem to have no critical problems with it. But the labels are very brief. The objects are presented with some information, but in a historical way and without the normal tedious political narratives that accompany museum labels. So what this allows us to do, and this is the primary experience of the visitor, is that you see ancient objects like as you would see modern works of art. So you see them as beautiful things without being commentary as an ethnographic representation of an alien culture, which unfortunately is the way in which many museums show works of art that are not European. The second museum I want to talk about, let's see, there's another slide from the Miho. Yes, so the second museum I want to talk about is the Louvre Abu Dhabi. It's one of the most significant museum openings in our world. It's only about a year old, but this is what it looks like. It's Jean Nouvel's design. It's brilliant, beautiful. There's a lot of money that is used to run it. And the acquisition fund is very rich. As the name suggests, it was set up by the Louvre in Paris, one of the world's foremost museums, both in terms of reputation and visitor numbers. So this is, the reason I find this particular museum fascinating is because it is one of the only so-called world museums formed in a site which is not a former imperial or colonial power. So what it has the right to be is to be, how can one country represent the world, or how it sees the world? That is what it's capable of doing. Did it succeed? Let's have a look. Oh, apparently I can move my own slides. Oh, there. That's the building. It's rather beautiful. So this is the opening display of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. In my opinion, it's one of the most successful opening permanent displays in a museum. The floor design, this is permanent, is etched in different languages with all the places of origin from where the collections come. And one of the slides shows the masks from different parts of the world. So basically, the idea of the museum is to show an interplay of civilizations. So here they show 3 different masks from 3 different continents. So it's Peru, China, and the Middle East. This is very successful. It shows that people essentially are the same, which is the message of the museum. But does it succeed in telling those messages in successive galleries? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is because it is a Louvre, a derived project. The Eurocentrism is poisonous. It leaches through into every display, into every curatorial decision, into every acquisition. So in the end, you get a large bunch of Europe and very little of anywhere else. So you have a world history told in which China interacts with, through the Middle East, interacts with Europe. So places like India are completely eluded. Of course, as an Indian, I look out for Indian arts and Indian objects, and I found us to be dramatically underrepresented. There are multiple reasons for that, and I'll go into that. One of the problems with the underrepresentation of Indian art is logistical. You can't really buy a lot of Indian art in the open market today, and that brings me to the last part of my talk, which is about why. What are the problem with Indian laws that prevent India's art market from developing in the same way like the rest of the world? So unfortunately, India stands very low in the wider economy of cultural exchange within the museum network. We don't have enough well-run museums. This is sad because we started the race at the same time and the same impetus as the world museums I mentioned. While museums were being built in London and elsewhere, they were also being built in India, both by the British and by the Indian princely order, which made grand buildings and endowed them with collections, staff, and funds. But after independence, socialism made museums into overt tools of state propaganda, while at the same time stripping them of funds, staff, and autonomy, so that these institutions, rather than becoming places for scholarship, expertise, and conservation, became sites of acute mediocrity and malpractice. After independence, Indian attitude to art also changed. It became a rather Soviet one. Art was seen as frivolous and expendable and a luxury for the rich. So our own dharmic connection with rasa and kala was broken. And so while in British India, wealthy Indians made important collections of art on the model of the European civility and taste, the Tata gift to the, I'm going to try to say the name because it's complicated, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Vastu Mahasangralaya or something, CSMVS. It used to be the Prince of Wales Museum, which is a colonial name, but easier to pronounce.
May I request you to conclude?
Okay. So, but the end result is, due to our bad laws, Indians today, wealthy Indians, spend the lowest proportion of their disposable wealth on art as compared to any other part of the world. I know, not a big problem for the large picture of things, but a huge problem in the way soft power is conveyed. So the big law that is responsible for this, and this is about how we can tick off solutions, is a 1972 act called the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act. It essentially means that the Indian art market is completely segregated from the world market. If you buy things abroad, you can't bring them in here. If you have things here, you can't sell them on the open art market. All this does is it encourages thieves and smugglers. So Indian art, which is authenticated, has provenance, is very hard to get hold of. So art collectors can't buy it and museums can't buy it. The second major bottleneck is that museums are not autonomous. Our museums are run largely by bureaucrats, which means that there is very little idea of international best practice in how museums work. The third is what Nauri says about the network of exchange. Museums have a very well, I mean, there are huge problems with their museums run. I pointed some of them out. But what they have is certain best practice. They are able to get large amounts of art from one part of the world to be shown in another part, and they're very good at that. For example, you have modernist masterpieces in Russia showing in London, you have art from France showing in the Middle East, and you have China sending the first emperor terracotta warriors to Britain. These are all very successful examples of public diplomacy and soft power. India can't engage in this because it doesn't accept something called sovereign indemnity. This is a very easily fixable problem. Sovereign indemnity simply means that the government of the country accepts insurance for museums that are national or national standing. But India, if I want to bring some art into India, I have to buy commercial insurance for it. Sovereign indemnity works in both directions. For example, if India accepts sovereign indemnity, then any work of art coming into India can also be insured.
May I please request you to conclude?
Oh, that's it. So basically, we have logistical bottlenecks. We need to fix them. Only then will our museums be able to operate on an international level and basically help with the soft power initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I request Nalina now?
I know I really am the one who stands between you and lunch. I'm going to keep it really short, also because I had a little misfunction this morning with my laptop, which is not internet enabled. Google that to find out what that means to a civil servant in Singapore. And when I was listening to Mr. Wang speak this morning, he struck a chord with me when he said telling a story about people in which they see themselves is what we very much do in a museum. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to tell you a story about where I come from, or where I've been living for the last decade, and what we do at our museum, and how Singapore, which is perhaps the smallest city-state in Asia, exercises considerable soft power in engaging India. I come from a museum called the Indian Heritage Center. The name might suggest that this might be an initiative of the government of India, but it is not. It is an initiative solely of the government of Singapore with the support of the local Indian community, who stand at about 9.2%. So I hope I, in my sari, stand as a reminder of how dear the Indian diaspora holds its Indian heritage. The Indian Heritage Center was an initiative that was mooted first in the 1980s in a letter to the newspaper, the Straits Times. However, it came into fruition only in 2009. We are a museum that has been longer in gestation than we have been open. We were one of the gifts to the nation of Singapore on its 50th birthday, which was in 2015. So we opened our door just a little over 3 years ago. And what we do at the center is remind visitors of the very long courtship that India has had with Southeast Asia, that we date at least to the 1st century CE, and that perhaps is how far back we can date soft power, going at least between the regions in Asia. So having a museum that had absolutely no collection to call its own, that had, even within the national collection, which was, like Nauri said, a bulk that was inherited as a result of colonial legacy, that had absolutely no representation of the Indian natives that were living on the island. And therefore, we had a null board to start with. We began collecting for the museum, and today we have an important but small collection of antiquities that demonstrate Southeast Asia's connections with India. We are very clear to say that this is not a journey of Indianization. We say very clearly that Southeast Asia was a developed region that borrowed ideas that appealed, clearly making it so that India was an attractive civilization that was persuading Southeast Asia in some way to adopt ideas of perhaps religion and trade that you find flourishing even today in many parts of Southeast Asia, particularly so, say, in Bali or in Java. From having looked at a whole preface to the Singapore Indian experience in the form of Southeast Asia's Indian heritage, we proceed to establish the roots of Singapore's diverse Indian communities. And when we say Indian, of course, in the museum's context, we're talking about a diaspora that moved there much before partition. Migration began in the 19th century. The first Indians arrived there with Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819. Next year is 200 years of Singapore's founding as a modern nation. And that's when we begin the tracing of migration to Singapore. So we can't really talk about Indian as an identity that is restricted to the political identity that it is today, but we're talking about people who trace their roots to present-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even Nepal, to that matter. And in doing so, we're talking about a very diverse heritage. And what exactly have we achieved in the museum? Very quickly, on an aside, while we were waiting on the sidelines to get on stage, Nauri, the self-professed museum doctor, midwife, gave us a clean chit. She said, I was at your museum last year and I very much enjoyed it. So, clearly there is some element of something right that we're doing at the museum. So you are listening to something that you should, I hope I persuade you to come and visit at the end of this. At the museum, what do? We connect the diaspora with heritage that they've left behind, that they perhaps traveled with, but is now a very distant memory, because in terms of the diaspora, we are talking about a diaspora that's also different, not just in terms of its linguistic diversity, but that is disparate in its migrant history. There have been many waves of migration to Singapore. There are many who are 4th or 5th generation Singaporean Indians, but there could be alongside them somebody who moved there in the last decade and has recently become Singaporean. How do we then encompass a storyline that appeals to all of these different audiences, yet reminds them successfully of one common thing, of their Indian heritage? So we bring together our collection that is largely composed of acquisitions we made, either through purchase or donations. And when I say donations, they come from the local Indian community, so about 50% of what you might see at our museum comes from them. And we use their objects to tell a story that is not highlighting differences, but is one that is highlighting a commonality of experience, a commonality of history and culture. So at the museum, what we also do is we know fully well who our audience is. We know that while we are free to permanent residents and Singaporeans, we have a huge target market that is tourist. We are situated in the heart of Singapore's Little India Heritage District, which I believe 1 in 4 tourists visits. So, and we are also the only sort of cultural, historical experience that's open 6 days a week. So we automatically become a destination that most tourists visit. And therefore, we knew that we would have to create an experience that would, at the same time, appeal to a local audience that was rooted in its history, and yet to a tourist audience that had absolutely no idea what Singapore's own multicultural journey was, and perhaps in many cases thought Singapore was in China. You know, much of our visitorship is incidentally, while we have a huge footfall of Indians, both of local roots and of Indians who come from India, what is interesting is that a bulk of our visitorship is actually Chinese. They're either local Chinese or they're Chinese from China. And we realized that everything Indian became somehow suddenly very much associated with us. If people wanted to get a sense of what attire was like, what dress or language was like, they were coming to the museum to find out what this was. So in some ways, suddenly, Singapore, which has always been at the crossroads of Southeast Asia, India, and East Asia, seemed to revisit its role of the past. We were now suddenly introducing India and Indian heritage to tourists who might not make their way to South Asia and were just stopping by Singapore for a day on transit visits, etc. So our sort of exercise in planning our exhibition became something that was multi-layered and multi-dimensional in terms of the audiences we were catering to. Now, apart from the collection itself relating to the Indian heritage of the community, we also wanted to relate to the collective memories that the communities were divided by. They didn't know each other's stories. As I was saying earlier, the community there is as diverse as it is in South Asia. So perhaps very much so there had been associational life that was built around their own linguistic or religious groups, and therefore they got divorced from the collective stories that they as one community had gone through, especially in the case of history. So we wanted to create spaces within the museum that would help people understand their common stories through the exercise of collective memory. And as I was saying, we were a museum that started off without a collection to speak of. So we undertook an oral history collection drive, and till date we have over 300 stories that we feature in our galleries that talk about experiences that range from migration to the years of war war and the period of influence of the nationalist and sub-ethnic nationalist movements from the subcontinent is a very popular gallery, not just with the locals, but also with visiting Indian tourists, because they see, for instance, busts that the Indian government had gifted us, busts of Nehru, Gandhi, Bose, all of whom had immense appeal and influence over the diaspora, and also that war was an experience that was very much trans-regional. Singaporean Indians today have families who left Singapore and came back to India as refugees, because at that time they'd already been divorced from their families in India, and they were going back to India for sort of refuge at that time of war. So these stories evoke a sort of a collective experience, a collective shared experience that they can connect with. And we then sort of, apart from the tourists, we have in the recent years since we opened, have become very popular for visits by state leaders as well. I mean, most recently in June this year, the Prime Minister of India visited the Indian Heritage Center, and one of the key places that he wanted to stop at was the Indian National Army section of the gallery, simply because, of course, you know, we have an immense appeal in terms of the collection that we have in terms of the nationalist collection, because these are not from India. They are collected entirely from INA veterans who live still in Singapore, Malaysia, or at least their descendants still live there. So there is a chord that reminds us of the diaspora's connections with the source community and its politics even today. Yeah, okay, I'm going to wrap up. And lastly, I must say that we offer a space for social cohesion and emotional connection. We are a space that young children come to, and they come to perhaps not knowing their distinctiveness in terms of their neighbor that they're dealing with. We have foreign schools coming at the same time as local schools, and we offer a common space for interaction, and we do so through technology and installations that we've commissioned especially for the experiences that we want to offer in the galleries, and these could be find your hometowns or communities. So that was just in a very quick nutshell how we try to use the museum space as a place of soft power. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. And I think I open the session to any questions, but we'll be brisk because the questions are, you know, a pre-lunch. So, yeah, yes. Could you even tell us who you're addressing the question to, please? Okay.
Check, check. Okay. The examples that you give, I visited the European Parliament Museum, which is exceptional in terms of, you know, interactive audience experiences. But how do you scale and sort of make that a sustainable model for other museums across the world? Is there a, you know, any specific you know, experience that you have had so that you can implement the similar methods in different other museums? And how do you sort of attract, so that museum attracts a lot of young audience and they play around with, you know, artifacts and things like that. And there are different ways they interact with through technology.
So what is your question?
So the first one is that how can we create a more sustainable
so we'll take
model?
That. We'll take that. Thank you.
All
And
right.
any more questions? Yes. Yes, ma'am. And then we can answer.
Nairi, I'd like to ask you, when you talked about museums of the future, could it also come to mean a collection of galleries carrying on different interactive activities? And could that be termed as a museum? Because I've been recently involved in setting up one, and there was a long debate on a museum must have this, that, and the other, and it was all getting very serious and in a way pompous. But I thought it should be fun, it should be attractive, and could a lot of gallery spaces in a very large building, which isn't on its own, be called a museum?
Thank you so much. And yes, right at the back there. Yes, yes, sir. Yes.
my question is primarily addressed to Nair. Regarding the museums, you have mentioned the proliferation of museums, but as you know, a lot of museums are also threatened with closure, especially in the West, because there is not enough funding. And there has been, especially in Italy, which has plenty of museums, but also in France and in other European countries, a drive to privatize museums and essentially make them dependent on corporate sponsorship. And that has aroused a lot of resistance. Are you in favor of that? Or do you think it is endangering the cultural mission of museums by making them essentially attributes of corporate private power? Thank you.
So the first question, will you take that? It was in your presentation.
How do you make a very successful museum that you visited into a model that can be replicated elsewhere? Is that essentially the question? That's not a good model to follow. Museums should be place-specific and people-specific, and the most successful models, like Nalina said, are the ones that are located in the places where they are, interacting with the people they serve, which is the local population. And in my view, if a museum is successful for its local population, it will automatically be successful for anyone who visits from elsewhere. That's the fundamental purpose.
So what you're saying is there's no one thumb rule for all museums?
No, it needs to be specific. You can have certain broad principles that appeal, which is, I think I already talked about them, the fact that they should be, the entrance should be open, or could be, not so expensive, etc., etc. But it has to be rooted in the place, people, and the things that it is the museum of. Because a museum is a thought generator. Going on to the next question, I don't know, somebody else can expand on it. But essentially, a museum isn't about things, not even about buildings. It is about generating thought. Museum is essentially that. So it could take any form, whatever thing that generates thought is a museum.
So basically what we summarize is that museums will have some guidelines, but each will be unique depending on the local place and population. Yeah. Okay, so the next question, who's going to take? Okay.
Yeah, but I think, of course, the stories of museums have to be unique. But I think that the idea that I talked about, like sort of the 4 E's, which are principles that can be, discovered in a different kind of ways, but we never think about, which is around like getting our security guards to also be nice to other people, making sure that we open on time and that we let people come in if they want to, getting to talk to people, talking about learning. All of those kinds of things are things that we don't think about as being important in museums. And I think that those are really important, and they have to be explored in a particular context. I think in terms of the woman about what constitutes museum, yes. Of course it can be a museum. A museum doesn't have to have a collection. I think it's something that has to be about education and learning. It doesn't even have to be a building, in fact. I think that it has to be credible. I think that it has to have a story. I think it has to have multiple perspectives, but you can really figure out what it is, how you want. And then in terms of the Italian question, I think that maybe that's something that we can talk about after, because I think that the European example and the Italian example is very, very specific, and what constitutes legitimacy in terms of the private sector, public-private partnerships, and government is extremely different than what we're talking about in India, where public-private partnerships, I think, are really important, and maybe having only public museums are not necessarily the best answer for soft power and credibility. So I think that every country is very different, and every city is different.
Very country-specific. So Nalina, would you like to add something, please?
Yeah, if I could just offer you an example. I know your specific case, so I'm going to give you the example of the Immigration Museum in London that's currently operating out of a community center. All they have is branding, and they have a wonderful narrative. I don't think you need a museum to be in a physical building. It could be just a website. But in your specific case, you do have another identity to grapple with because you're in somebody else's space. And I think branding and having a very clear narrative, which you do, would be a wonderful way to begin with. And perhaps if you'd like to look up this example and touch base with them, I think they might be able to offer you a lot of advice in that way.
Thank you so much. So I think museums are the next soft power centers, and you don't really need a place.
If done well, they are very susceptible to be done very poorly.
So thank you, all three of you. Thank you so much for your time. And I now request Vijaya Lakshmi, Vijay Kumarji to please come up on the dais and felicitate the guests. Thank you so much.
May I request Vijayalakshmi ma'am to also felicitate Masuma ma'am for chairing this session. Thank you so much. We break for lunch and we'll be back at 2:30 sharp for an interesting panel discussion on performing arts. Thank you.